The Bibi Files reveals leaked interrogation footage of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that brings a crucial context to the wars he's been waging. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. On this episode, I speak with producer Alex Gibney and director Alexis Bloom about their collaboration on the Bibi Files. The project got started in spring of 2023 when an anonymous source contacted Gibney offering a vast trove of leaked footage. They were video files of an Israeli police investigation that started in 2016 and lasted for 3 years. The result was an indictment against Netanyahu on charges of corruption in 2019. In the film, we watch police interrogations with Netanyahu, his wife Sarah, and their son Yair, along with many other witnesses. One of the main allegations is that the Netanyahus repeatedly sought luxury items from their rich friends in exchange for political favors. We see interrogations of the Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan and the Las Vegas casino owners Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, who testify about feeling pressure from the Netanyahus to bring them expensive gifts, including cigars, champagne, and jewelry. Another allegation is that the Netanyahus repeatedly interfered with press coverage from an Israeli news outlet in exchange for giving political favors to its owner. In the grand scheme of recent atrocities, these issues may sound secondary, but the film draws a connection between them. Past Israeli leaders who faced similar corruption charges have either resigned or gone to jail. Israeli investigative journalist Raviv Drucker is a producer on the Bibi Files and also appears on camera. He explains why the footage feels significant.
You have a rare opportunity to see the most powerful people in Israel in interrogation rooms dealing with questions that were never been asked. What did you give? What did you get? How many times you met him? And you see people in the most tense part of their life.
As a producer, Gibney has spent decades covering corruption in politics, business, religion, and sports. For the Bibi Files, he turned to director Alexis Bloom, reuniting after previous collaborations. Bloom was a producer for Gibney on the film We Steal Secrets, the story of WikiLeaks in 2013, and Gibney produced Bloom's film Divide and Conquer, the story of Roger Ailes, about the Fox News TV executive in 2018. Bloom and her husband Fisher Stevens also directed Bright Lights, about the mother-daughter relationship between Debbie Reynolds and Carrie Fisher. In the Bibi Files, the interrogation tapes are just one element. Bloom also interviews a wide range of figures in Israel for further context. One of them is Uzi Beller, who is friends with Netanyahu since childhood and only recently began speaking out against him.
Bibi lies left and right. He uses, lie for him is not something bad. Seriously. And he doesn't feel any problem with that.
Bloom interviewed former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who went through his own corruption investigation and resigned. In contrast, Netanyahu put up a fierce resistance. The film details that when he started to lose allies, he joined forces with an extreme right wing to stay in power. He even sought to change Israel's judicial process that brought out mass street protests in 2023. Then came the Hamas attacks of October 7th that gave Netanyahu a new excuse to postpone his trial while he expanded wars in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond, killing tens of thousands. Bloom interviews a young Israeli woman named Gilly Schwartz, who lives near the Gaza border in Kibbutz Be'eri. Schwartz knows over 90 people who were killed in the October 7th attacks, but she's deeply opposed to how Netanyahu has waged war.
Bibi has not been to Be'eri since October 7th, and I don't want him to come, because I would never welcome him in my home. He was prime minister ever since I can remember, and living on the border, I always felt the effects of that, negative effects of that always, of his choices and his policies and how that affected me. and later his corruption as well. And I don't want to hear his name. I don't want to see his face. I'm exhausted of him.
The Bibi Files was first revealed to the world in September, when it had a work-in-progress screening at the Toronto International Film Festival, where I work as the documentary programmer. As soon as the screening was announced, Netanyahu went to court trying to get it canceled. That motion failed. It's now finished and being distributed around the world, although not officially in Israel. The reason for that is Gibney had agreed with a source to exclude Israel from distribution deals. There are local laws that prohibit showing the footage while a trial is still ongoing. Gibney accepted those terms, but that hasn't stopped the film from being pirated in Israel. The Bibi Files is now on the short list of 15 feature documentary films to be considered for the Academy Awards. I reached the filmmakers by Zoom last week. Alex was at his home in Maine, and Alexis was visiting family in South Africa. I started by asking Alexis how she came to investigative documentary in the first place.
Oh, what led me into investigative documentary? I guess, formally speaking, I started out working at Frontline when I was a student at UC Berkeley. My first job was being an assistant editor doing the night shift at Frontline in 1998. And then I became an AP there. They had an outpost in the Bay Area, and I was really lucky. I got to work with some great producers, Doug Hamilton, Lowell Bergman, and they sort of tucked me under their wing, and if you worked hard enough, you carried on working with them. So that's, I guess, what formally started me on this path.
And then how did you first start working with Alex?
I stalked him, I think. I wanted to work. I moved to New York and I was watching documentaries and I thought, who is the person who I most want to work with? And it was Alex. And then I asked around whether anybody knew him, and Charles Ferguson did, in fact. And he wrote me a letter of introduction. And I remember Alex was kind enough to meet me one day. And I just said, I'll work with you on anything at any time. And he said, yeah, sure. And then I left and I didn't hear from him for ages. And I thought, oh, that didn't go very well. And then one day he called me because he was making a film about Julian Assange and needed international experience. And I was international. So that was that.
And so, Alex, when you were working with Alexis, as she produced the WikiLeaks film, what were the qualities that you saw in her?
Well, I mean, she was a capable producer. She was clearly very smart. And also, you know, as Alexis says, she had a tremendous amount of international perspective and experience, which on that film was really important, you know, because a lot of the people you find in America, sadly, you know, Americans have a tendency to be somewhat myopic in terms of their ability to understand the world outside America's borders. And Alexis, you know, lived a life of international intrigue, and as well as, you know, having all of this experience. And she had these journalistic chops, which are very valuable to me. So, because this was going to be a tough story to dig out. And so, you know, it turned out to be perfect. It was one of those things I feel bad for not having gotten back to Alexis right away.
Okay,
forgotten that part of it.
Contact you. You did in the end.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
So, Alexis, prior to working on the Bibi Files, can you describe your history of reporting in Israel?
I worked on a film about the last Christians of Bethlehem. That's what it was called, rather depressingly. There used to be a very big, flourishing Christian community in and around Bethlehem. And over the years, they've been sort of eroded between the larger Muslim and Jewish populations and caught in the crossfire, metaphorically and quite literally. The film, I field produced it. in fact. But the directors didn't come to the region, so I did all the interviews. I did all the shooting, basically. And it was around the Siege of the Nativity, which was the Church of the Nativity. In the early 90s, there'd been a siege where a whole group of sort of, I think at that time it was the PLO. Anyway, it was Islamic terrorists / freedom fighters and versus Jewish security forces / IDF. And there was a shootout. People were holed up in the Church of the Nativity. There were hostages taken, and it was a story about that one siege and how it was an allegory for the siege of the Christians more broadly. And I spent, I think, 4 weeks there in total shooting that story. So, I mean, that was a wonderful experience for me in my mid-20s. And I'd been to the region a lot. One of my great friends was a reporter there. I used to visit her. I've been to Israel, I mean, since I was 6 or 7. So I have a history there.
So, Alex, as I understand the origins of this project, the Bibi Files, someone reached out to you in spring of 2023 saying, I have some material that could be interesting. You pulled on that thread and eventually got this trove of interrogation tapes. Can you describe, the scope of the material that you received?
Yeah, it was massive. I mean, I think it's over 1,000 hours. And the fact is that these were police interrogation videos intended to be, this sort of foundational element of an inquiry into whether or not Netanyahu should be indicted for corruption. So they were wide-ranging. They contained a lot of material of interviews with Netanyahu, also his wife Sarah, his son Yair, but also a lot of people who were involved with the corruptions, not only the people who were being bribed, but the people who were doing the bribing. So it was kind of stunning material. And of course, I don't speak Hebrew. So I had some sense of what was there. And even by looking at a little bit, I thought, wow, this would be really interesting to see a figure like Netanyahu, who so choreographs his public image, to see him in a more private setting. It's not entirely private, and he's clearly performative in terms of what he's doing, but it's not the grand stage, and he's also at the mercy of interrogators who have him in a chair. And of course, visually, it was kind of stunning, too, because they shot the interviews with Netanyahu in his office, a rather small, cramped space, but he sits in front of a map of the Middle East, which seemed like, you would have had your production designer, erected if it hadn't already been in place. So for all those reasons, it seemed to be a very powerful film. And obviously, I have a record of doing stuff about corruption. I engaged a guy named Raviv Drucker, who's one of the producers on the film, who helped to confirm sort of the enormous power of this material, and also to help us parse it. And I reached out to Alexis to see if she would direct, because she was the first person I thought of who could really do this the right way. And, because since WikiLeaks, I had also produced a film that Alexis had done called Divide and Conquer about Roger Ailes. And that was both a very, skillfully made film, and also it had a lot of journalistic rigor. And I thought this is, this film really has a high bar. And so I thought of Alexis right off the bat.
So, Alexis, when Alex brought this project to you, what were the things that, went through your mind, taking on an investigative project against the highly politicized backdrop of the Middle East, with leaked footage involving a government that is known for its intense protectiveness and surveillance. And I mean, you must have known that you were going to be setting yourself up for a year or more of intensity. I mean, it's not the same as making a film about Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds.
No, but all films are intense. I mean, believe me, Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds were intense in a different way. You know, it's, you know, I don't regard it as daunting or, you know, off-putting in that way. It's immediately and absolutely attractive and fascinating. If you read about the Middle East, if you do journalism, I come from a journalism background, so it's what I've spent my whole life wanting to do. These kind of films, they just don't get made very often, and they don't get funded that often. There was no hesitation on my part whatsoever, and no thought of it being a difficult situation for me personally. You know, I did think in the beginning, oh my God, am I qualified to do it? You know, the Middle East is also quite a macho reporting space. When you go to a party, you know, for the bureaus in Jerusalem, it's a lot of dudes. And you know, you have that thing of imposter syndrome, like, oh my God, am I really qualified to make this? So the first thing I did was go and read every biography on Netanyahu. I knew about him, but there are a lot of bloody biographies. So I spent, you know, hours every day reading the minutiae, and then I was like, I can totally do this. But there was no hesitation on my part at all. But remember that it was before October 7th. And it was going to be a film about the democratic backsliding in Israel and the proposed overhaul in the judicial system. And I was sitting with my husband on the subway, and he just made the David Beckham Netflix series. And I remember him saying to me, you know, Lex, do you not want to do something slightly more commercial? Because is anyone really going to watch a film about the, you know, proposed overhaul of the Israeli judicial system? And I was like, I think they will, Fish. I think they will. But, you know, events overtook us.
I think also it should be said that, you know, Alexis is trying to make it sound like the most obscure thing ever. But I mean, this, you know, even at that moment, even pre-October 7th, what you were seeing in Israel was an attempt by Netanyahu not only to avoid a legal reckoning, i.e., corruption of a major political figure, which we're all too familiar with, but also his attempts to take Israel in a more authoritarian direction, to try to accrete more power to himself. Well, this is that was a pattern that we were seeing all over the world, from Trump to Putin to Orban, etc. So it had a certain valence even before October 7th, I think.
So in the footage, we see not only the Netanyahus being interrogated, but other very powerful figures: Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan, Sheldon Adelson and Miriam Adelson, the Las Vegas casino owners who are major political donors. And I mean, these are powerful people that we rarely see looking so vulnerable as they are in this interrogation room. Arnon Milchan even says something to the fact, if this gets out, I'll be ruined. As far as I can tell, he hasn't been ruined. He still seems to have a successful Hollywood producing career. But I wonder, in following this, have you recognized any change in the relationship between powerful figures like those being interviewed in these interrogation tapes and the Netanyahus?
I mean, Arnon is not friendly with the Netanyahus anymore. That's for sure. He hasn't been back to Israel since his interrogations. So that's a huge change. You know, he used to spend a lot of time there, and he was tax exempt there, which was one of the points of contention in the corruption case, is why he had his tax exemption, and the fact that he wanted to extend it, and Netanyahu was willing to do that for him. And notably, he hasn't set foot back in Israel. And he doesn't hang out with them anymore. These relationships are fascinating because people sort of lock onto each other, and it's almost like they can't totally unlock. Milton had his hearings in court in Brighton, in England, in a hotel room. That's the sort of third party place that they agreed upon to do the interrogations, because he wouldn't go back to Israel. He said he was too ill to fly, but I guess he could fly to England. And Sarah Netanyahu went from Tel Aviv to Brighton to sit opposite him in the court case. So it's almost as if she's saying to him, we don't hang out. Our relationship is different. It's changed, but I'm still here, and you're going to see the whites of my eyes. So I don't think he can totally disentangle from them in some way. They know that he knows, and it's sort of like a mutual vow of sort of secrecy. They're both in it together at this point. I mean, it did remind me a little bit of a mob boss, who flies all the way to like sit in the front row and stare at the witness. Sarah does.
And she did that during a trial, not during the interrogations, but
no, during the trial. It was probably about 6 months ago. So he was called to the witness stand, and normally it goes on in Israel, and he said he was too ill to fly, so they found a hotel in Brighton, and immediately she jumped on the plane, and went and sat there for his witness, sort of for his testimony.
This is a trial, by the way, that's been going on for 4 years.
And continues to go on. So,
yeah.
Alexis, you gained new interviews with all kinds of key figures in Netanyahu's world and the world of Israel, a former prime minister, people who've worked with Netanyahu, a childhood friend of Netanyahu's. What was it like getting those interviews? Was it difficult to get them to talk? Are they willing to talk?
Well, the really difficult ones I didn't get. I spoke to a lot of people who wouldn't go on camera as well. So I'll say that, there are a lot of sort of security establishment people, because of the war, they felt like they ought not to speak against Netanyahu, even though they had the most hair-raising things to say about him. Really sort of terrifying, to be honest. So some of the interviews were more difficult to get than others. A portion of them, Raviv was very helpful in getting. So, for instance, Olmert.
Raviv Drucker,
yes.
the Israeli journalist who's a producer on this.
Yeah, and he's super smart and knows the landscape. So if I mean, for instance, with Olmert, this it also shows you the value of having local partnerships and listening to people. I mean, I'd say, okay, Olmert, Raviv, I really want to speak to him. He'd go, Sarah is the key. He has an assistant called Sarah. Sorry, not Sarah Netanyahu. You've got to get her to get to him. So, I advise anyone who makes these films to try and, make friends locally and form partnerships and collaborations, because they're super, super useful. I mean, some people were civilians. People have, responded very favorably to a young woman called Gilly Schwartz, who we interviewed, who, I found on X on October 9th. She posted a little video clip just saying that she lived in the kibbutz on the border, and her friends and family, had suffered, but she didn't want the war to take place in her name. And she said, she gave this very impassioned speech about how she didn't want October 7th to be politicized or to be used as an excuse to flatten Gaza. And she stayed with me, her testimony stayed with me. So I found her, through online sources and just, doing some digging. So, every person is different. Uzi Bella, I found in one of those biographies that I was reading. He was mentioned. Some of Netanyahu's friends are dead. He's of that age. Some, many no longer talk to him, have not spoken to him in years. And Uzi was one of the last standing, as he says in the film. Everyone says, "Oh, you're his friend." I guess I am. You've just got to sort of dig deep and you find people in different ways.
So, I mean, you're making this film at a time when coverage of Israel and Palestine is highly politicized. And, in the middle of production, I'm thinking of the convulsions on university campuses last spring. There's a pro-Israel side that can be quick to accuse any critics of Israel as anti-Semitic. There's a pro-Palestinian side that may feel this corruption court case of Netanyahu is a distraction for worse atrocities taking place. How did you think about the audience for this film as you were making it?
I do think that so much of what goes on in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or Israelis and Palestinians, has to do, with a kind of a tribal lens, and either for one side or for the other. It seemed to me that the way to frame this film was as a film about universal human rights and universal human issues. And if you do it that way, then it should be able to be approached by everybody. I mean, corruption is not a problem that's unique to Benjamin Netanyahu. You can see it from a political perspective, or the perspective of a political economy. And also, I think it's important in this instance to separate Netanyahu, the character, from an identification that he often makes between himself and the Israeli state. L'état c'est moi. You attack me, you attack the very idea of Israel. No. And that was, I think, the value of so many of the interview subjects that Alexis found to speak, where it was clear that they were making a very explicit division between Netanyahu and the Israeli state. And so there can be arguments about, past depredations by Israel. But in this case, we were focusing on this one individual and how he was actually using that kind of cheap tribal appeal to both shield himself from legal accountability and also to engage in a kind of campaign of killing that it is sort of staggering in its scope, and is also designed to continue to enable him as the wartime prime minister who should be above any criticism. So that kind of monumental corruption is something that is not either unique to Netanyahu, but also sets it apart from the more traditional tribal approaches to this issue, even as it focuses some of the attention on it. But I think you can see, the flattening of Gaza, for example, within the context of a human rights problem, rather than our team, their team.
Yeah. I mean, I think with this, if you go in thinking about the audience with a film like this, you're fairly stuffed, to be honest. You have to figure out what you think and what you want to say. Because the audience in this case is so contentious and so caught up. Starting at the beginning, that you have to thread the needle carefully. So you start a film like this being judicious, and you have to continue it, all the way through and never let that slip. But you can't go in thinking you're making it for one audience or for another. I think also if you know this subject, you know what the landmines are. Occupation is a landmine, occupation versus security. And thank goodness that wasn't this film. It was always a film about one family, and what this family has wrought. So anytime it veered too far off that, we brought it back. You have to think about it I always think about it like the invisible thread, and it's always connected back to Netanyahu. So it's a family portrait, and it's a story about his relationship with his wife, with his son, and his sort of gargantuan entitlement and what it's wrought. So, I think starting off, we also knew that it wasn't going to wade into these, sort of insanely contentious issues that will play out over generations. I don't know whether, who can solve, occupation versus security. What is occupation and what is security? I mean, that's a film that will upend even the steadiest hand.
I do think this subject of who is a film for is fraught. My answer to that is always it's for everybody. It's for human beings. That's who the film is for. And I think as you start thinking that way, it gives you some guidance.
So, Alex, I'm thinking back to your film in 2016, 0 Days, which also dealt with Israel, the computer malware that Israel and the United States reportedly deployed against Iran. And when that film had its premiere at the Berlin Film Festival, you had been collaborating with the New York Times to do a report about the what you'd uncovered in the film at the same time, a kind of dual system of bringing attention to this material. Last summer, when we were talking about this film for the Toronto Film Festival, I know you were talking to different news organizations to maybe do something similar, and it from my point of view, it seemed like there was, for different reasons, for whatever reason, that didn't come together, and I wonder if it reflects a certain reticence around this material for other news organizations, or?
Yeah, I think it does. And sometimes for good and bad reasons. Sometimes not necessarily for wanting to avoid controversy. I can think of one print outlet that was all for embracing the controversy, but we had a technical problem, i.e., we can't be seen to be distributing in any way, shape, or form the interrogation videos in Israel. And this one print platform, was going to have some of those on its website, which would have been freely available in Israel. So that was a technical problem. But I think the more concerning one for me was another broadcast organization, a news organization, which decided that, it was kind of teed up to do a story, but decided that it wasn't worth doing because it would upset it would upset Netanyahu, which therefore would put their bureau in Jerusalem in a difficult position, but which they were willing to do so long as they and they alone could take credit for unearthing the material. But because we had found it, they couldn't take corporate credit, which I found to be kind of the most pathetically venal excuse I could possibly think of. So that you're either here to inform audiences and speak truth to power, or you're not. So anyway, there was certainly reticence by other outlets considering the controversy of the topic and the idea that this was something that this is a film about a sitting prime minister. I think there was that concern, remains that concern.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting contrast to the way the film has been covered in Israel, where all the major news outlets gave it extensive coverage for when it debuted in September and in the months since, and as it's been pirated in Israel. And the I don't know, I just feel for a film of the level of revelations that this contains, it's had a more muted response, even amongst film reviewers in major U.S. outlets.
I agree, and some, and a lot of it has to do with the opinion by a number of the interview subjects in the film that Netanyahu both failed in his security approach prior to 10/7 and also prosecuted a kind of endless war post 10/7 in order both to stay in power and also to elude responsibility for or elude a legal reckoning for his corruption charges. So, those were opinions by interview subjects that Alexis found for the film. I find it odd that outlets outside of Israel should be so squeamish about those opinions when they're constantly debated and aired routinely in Israel. But that is the way it has gone in many cases, where some notable publications in this country won't even review the film because they find those opinions, which are relatively mainstream in at least a certain segment of Israeli society, to be beyond the bounds of proper journalistic standards in this country. I find it kind of laughable.
It's chicken shit. It really is. I mean, there's one newspaper who wouldn't review it. They, too contentious. We're not even going to write the review. And then that same newspaper, a few weeks later, published this fawning interview with Netanyahu, like an exclusive in quotation marks, with a writer who wasn't one of their usual writers, not a staff writer, but a freelance writer who managed to get an interview with Netanyahu. And that was a big deal. So they published that, but they wouldn't publish this. I'm really disappointed.
Well, Alexis, I mean, that raises this question of Netanyahu's relationship with the U.S. and the U.S. political establishment. You have a scene in the film where Netanyahu addressed Congress last summer to a standing ovation, at least to from a portion of Congress. This is at a time when tens of thousands of Palestinians are being bombed and killed. In your observation of this history, what do you see as the role of the United States in giving Netanyahu credibility?
Well, I will say, A, it's beyond the purview of the film, and B, I'm not American, so take whatever I say with a pinch of salt. But I think that the United States is a key relationship in terms of Netanyahu establishing his legitimacy worldwide, because the ICC has just issued an arrest warrant, so that he can't really legally go into any of the European countries anymore. And I honestly think he probably doesn't care, because as long as he can come to America, he's fine. He's brought up in America. He spent high school years here. He went to MIT. He loves Americans. And he has boasted that he can manipulate them better than any other leader. He said that. He's been caught on, tape saying that. He thinks he's, the man for the job in terms of America, that he's better than Obama. He's seen them all come and go. He's lasted longer than any American president. Well, obviously, because there's no term limits in Israel. And it's a key relationship for him. And I'm starting to think he's right, because even when administrations are privately very critical of him, as they have been recently with Biden and poor Anthony Blinken going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, Netanyahu will say one thing and do another, or just not inform the Americans of what he's going to do. And there's never, ever any repercussion. There's never any consequence.
I mean, you've both now spent more than a year studying what happens when a leader will go to extreme lengths to avoid being held to a standard of justice. out of that study, what stands out to you about the United States right now as Donald Trump is about to come to power with certain similar aspects of trials awaiting him and a penchant for trying to bend a judicial system to his will?
Well, there are certain obvious parallels in the film. I mean, I don't think they're obvious parallels, not because, I'll let Alexis speak to the intent, but they're just obvious parallels because the game played by both individuals are very much the same. And also, when you begin to discredit the judicial system, as Netanyahu did in Israel, and as Trump certainly did in the United States, there's a certain populist appeal that results. It's like, oh, the fix is in, the deep state is after him, we must rally round, and you can generate a certain amount of popular support. Not only that, but if you invoke the specter of the other, immigration in Donald Trump's view, Palestinians and Hezbollah and Iran and anybody else in the Middle East you can think of. In Netanyahu's case, you can wrap yourself in the mantle of a higher ideal, even as what you're really doing is trying to pursue power and elude a legal reckoning. So there are a lot of parallels, and of course a deeply divided country. Israel, I think, is deeply divided, as is the United States. And politicians like Netanyahu have learned, and Trump have learned to lean in to those divisions and to shore up a kind of hard right base that then, under certain circumstances, allows them to form coalitions which allow them to stay in power and then cement authoritarian mechanisms that that ensure that they continue in power.
Alexis, as I wrap this up, I want to ask, now that the film is out and being seen by audiences around the world, what has been the most gratifying response for you after more than a year of work on this?
Oh, what's been the most gratifying? I've had some incredible emails from people inside Israel. People have been writing to me, trying, different emails, my name, like alexis.bloom@gmail.com or alexisbloom@hotmail.com. And you can see all the different variations they're trying in the CC, to thank me for doing this film. Lots of people, like a grandmother wrote to me last week saying she was a grandmother and how everybody should watch this and how sad it makes her, but how gratified she is that somebody pulled this all together and gave the big picture and that it's got to make a difference. There's so many people who so strongly feel that Netanyahu is the captain of a ship that he is taking to the bottom of the sea. And they just need other people to see that and recognize that. So I've had loads of very touching emails that make me think it's been worthwhile. I've had some, really interesting interviews with people from the Middle East, with Arab journalists who've really appreciated the perspective too. And who've said to me, I can't believe that you've managed to do a big piece that's so, critical of an Israeli prime minister. Good for you, because we would never have been able to do this. So there've been a lot of really positive reactions. Diaspora Jews who believe strongly in Israel and who are very disenchanted with Netanyahu. There's always this tension in Israel between democracy and a Jewish state. And a lot of the diaspora Jews are holding on to the possibility of it still being a democracy.
I want to thank Alexis Bloom and Alex Gibney for speaking with me. The Bibi Files is now available from Jolt Film. See our show notes for details. We have an intense output coming up in January, including several episodes with filmmakers on the Oscar shortlist and extensive coverage from the Sundance Film Festival in our newsletter written by Bella Racklin. You'll find the newsletter Doc Voices on Substack. If you want to advertise to our 40,000 readers, send an email to listen@purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nahausen. I'm Tom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.